Imagine waking up to discover that the most influential portrait gallery in America, the guardian of historical icons, the mirror of national identity, had its director fired in a single presidential post. No lengthy trial, no subtle reshuffling, just a click, a few words, and a legacy thrown into turmoil. On March 28, 2025, that's exactly what happened. Kim Sajet, an internationally respected curator and scholar, was abruptly dismissed from the National Portrait Gallery by Donald Trump, himself the subject of one of its most controversial portraits. The reason? Alleged partisanship and open support for diversity, equity, and inclusion. Was this the act of a leader reclaiming an institution for the people, or a brazen power grab in the cultural wars of 21st century America? And perhaps most crucially, who actually gets to decide how history is told in the United States? Take a moment to picture the National Portrait Gallery. Nestled on the edge of Washington, D.C.'s National Mall, where millions shuffle past the Lincoln Memorial and the Capitol, this venerable museum houses over 26,000 works. Each is a piece of the American story, from George Washington to Beyoncé. For more than a decade, Kim Sajet, a Dutch national born in Nigeria and raised in Australia, led the institution. She managed the portrait gallery through shifting cultural tides, including the landmark unveiling of the Obama portraits and the stormy aftermath of the Trump years. The National Portrait Gallery isn't merely an art museum. It's a place where the nation's heroes, villains, and visionaries loom large, literally, in oil and acrylic. And, as the world watched on, it became the latest battleground in America's seemingly endless culture war. But how did we get here? And why does this battle over a single director signal far deeper fractures in the American system? First, we need to understand the unique role the Smithsonian Institution plays. Founded in 1846, the Smithsonian is a constellation of 21 museums and cultural centers. It's partly funded by taxpayer dollars, over $1.1 billion annually, yet it fiercely guards its quasi-independence. Historically, this structure was meant to buffer art and history from the winds of everyday politics. The theory? A nation's memory should be preserved above the partisan fray. But theory and reality sometimes diverge. During her tenure, Sajet faced storms. Under her leadership, the gallery became known for bold programming and, at times, controversy. There was the unveiling of the Obama portraits, a runaway hit that drew record crowds and sparked debate about the role of representation in state portraiture. There was also the much-discussed Trump portrait, whose official caption referenced impeachment not once but twice, and even mentioned the events of January 6th, the day the Capitol was overrun by supporters of the former president. Critics argued it was a necessary, honest accounting. Supporters of Trump called it a partisan betrayal. But while the gallery's exhibits simmered with tension, the real battle took place behind doors, in funding meetings, boardrooms, and ultimately, the White House. This brings us to the moment that changed everything. Donald Trump's executive order, grandly titled Restoring Truth and Sanity to American History. Signed on March 27, 2025, it declared war on what he called divisive narratives and anti-American ideology. Almost immediately, the implications were clear. Programs promoting diversity, equity, and inclusion, known as DEI, were ordered to halt. Sajet, who had championed those very principles, was now directly in the administration's crosshairs. What followed was a domino effect. The Smithsonian, under pressure, rolled back DEI programs. Vice President J.D. Vance, appointed to oversee compliance, led efforts to root out race-centered ideology. Institutions across the city, long celebrated as spaces for education and open debate, were suddenly recasting their missions with new language. The National Gallery of Art, for example, quietly swapped out direct references to diversity and inclusion, opting to be welcoming and accessible. To some, these were cosmetic changes. To others, they signaled a chilling message. History itself was being rewritten, one mission statement at a time. As the firings and reforms mounted, the old line between government and culture blurred. Trump went further, ousting 18 board members from the Kennedy Center and appointing new trustees, including Second Lady Usha Vance. Proposed budgets slashed funds for key Smithsonian programs, especially those highlighting African American and Latino contributions. These actions sent shockwaves through the arts, stoking fears that this wasn't just about Sajet or even one museum, but a coordinated effort to redefine who gets to speak for the country. At the heart of the firestorm was the question, is this legal? Eric Columbus, a former federal litigator, pointed out, Trump lacks the power to fire Sajet, given the Smithsonian's independent status. Yet for all its quasi-independence, the Smithsonian relies on political appointees for its Board of Regents, and a substantial chunk of its annual budget comes from Congress, now firmly in Republican hands. For Sajet, the lines were just as fraught. She had publicly stated, "We try very hard to be even-handed when we talk about people." But political opponents highlighted her record of donations to Democratic campaigns, pointing to over $3,900 in contributions to Joe Biden and Hillary Clinton. They accused her of bias, of using public platforms to further a political agenda. This argument, over the neutrality of the museum director, quickly spiraled beyond Sajet herself. Shannon Jackson, chair of UC Berkeley's History of Art department, weighed in. Democratic countries don't censor culture to market a national administration. Autocratic countries do. Others, like history professor John Connolly, warned that every authoritarian regime tries to reshape its national narrative. The implication was stark. If the Smithsonian could be pressured, what chance do smaller institutions have? Meanwhile, voices rose in Sajet's defense. Daniel Sargent, an associate professor of history, argued, "Disagreement is central to the historical enterprise from which the government benefits." For him and many others, the gallery's role was to provoke dialogue, not fall silent in the face of political demands. Yet to supporters of Trump's policy, this was the restoration of common sense. The DEI programs, they claimed, fostered division and focused obsessively on identity at the expense of unity. Trump's move was, in this view, not censorship, but the reclamation of institutions that had drifted too far from their founding purpose. But underneath the slogans and rhetoric, a much thornier reality lurked. Could a president, any president, directly fire the curator of a cultural institution founded to withstand political pressure? Would the courts intervene, or would the Smithsonian's leaders bend quietly to the new reality? Legal scholars like Jonathan Turley noted that while the Smithsonian's independence offers a buffer, political pressure can still influence its direction. And in this climate, influence can feel as forceful as a formal order. As one museum staffer, speaking anonymously, put it, "We're all just waiting to see what happens next. Will they come for us too?" As Sajet packs her office and the news media pulses with outrage and celebration in equal measure, the scene is set for a battle that could rewrite the relationship between government, art, and history for a generation. What happens now? Will Sajet's firing hold up in court? Could it set a precedent for future presidents to remake America's cultural institutions at will? Or will this bold intervention provoke a backlash, galvanizing new protections and fresh sources of private funding to shield the Smithsonian from political storms? One thing is certain: whoever controls the past shapes the future. And right now, the very question of who gets to tell America's story hangs in the balance. The sudden dismissal of Kim Sajet from the National Portrait Gallery was not just about one individual or even a single institution. As the dust settles, the focus turns to what comes next. How will this episode echo through the halls of America's museums, the boardrooms of cultural organizations, and perhaps most importantly, the minds of future generations? Let's explore the possible scenarios, the real risks, and, surprisingly, the opportunities that may rise from this tumultuous moment. First, the most immediate question: will the firing actually stick? Legal experts are already weighing in. Eric Columbus, a former federal litigator, put it bluntly: Trump lacks the power to fire Sajet, given the Smithsonian's independent status. The Smithsonian straddles a unique line, funded by Congress, yet designed to be shielded from political whim. If Sajet chooses to fight, we could see a legal battle play out that tests not only the president's authority, but also the very nature of American cultural independence. Imagine, for a moment, the Supreme Court hearing arguments about whether a sitting president can dictate who tells the nation's stories. The result could set a precedent for decades to come. But even if Sajet's dismissal is overturned, the message has been sent. As Daniel J. Sargent, associate professor of history and public policy, noted, disagreement is central to the historical enterprise from which the government benefits. Yet, there's a real risk that museum directors and curators across the country might think twice before commissioning works or curating exhibitions that challenge the dominant narrative. Self-censorship, subtle and insidious, could creep in, not out of law, but out of fear. On the other hand, there is a chance for resistance and creative adaptation. Institutions under threat often turn to their communities for support. The public outcry following Sajet's firing has already sparked discussion about increasing private funding for the Smithsonian and similar museums. If congressional purse strings tighten or become politicized, could an energized public fill the gap? Some believe so. After all, the National Portrait Gallery's 26,000-piece collection only exists today because of both public trust and private generosity. Meanwhile, lawmakers in both parties are quietly preparing legislation that might shore up the Smithsonian's autonomy. Proposals range from explicit legal language protecting leadership from political interference to new funding models that reduce dependence on annual appropriations. For the first time in years, there is real movement in Congress to clarify and harden the institutional independence that has always been more tradition than statute. There is also the question of what happens inside the galleries themselves. With Trump's executive orders targeting divisive narratives and the rollback of diversity, equity, and inclusion policies, the Smithsonian's public face is shifting. The National Gallery of Art has already scrubbed direct references to diversity from its mission statement, and museums are under pressure to show a more unified, sanitized vision of American history. The danger, as pointed out by history professor John Connolly, is clear. Every fascist or right-wing authoritarian regime does all it can to shape the historical narrative. But history is never neutral. Portraits do not just hang silently on walls. They speak, sometimes in whispers, sometimes in outright defiance. Kim Sajet herself summed it up. We try very hard to be even-handed when we talk about people. Now the question is whether such even-handedness can survive, or whether the new era will demand that galleries pick a side, one way or another. Let's not forget the human consequences. Staff members, artists, and docents are uncertain whether their own jobs might be next if they voice unpopular opinions or support controversial exhibits. The ripple effects go wider still. University art departments, already under scrutiny, may see their graduates locked out of public institutions or forced to bend their creative vision to fit political imperatives. And yet, there is an opportunity hidden in the crisis. As history has shown again and again, moments of political clampdown can provoke extraordinary acts of courage and imagination. The American cultural landscape has not always been free or fair, but it has always been restless. Already, some museums are partnering with independent organizations to safeguard digital archives, host pop-up exhibits in unconventional spaces, and experiment with new ways of telling stories beyond the reach of government influence. But what does all this mean for you, watching right now? Why should any of this matter to someone who's never set foot in the Smithsonian or who sees museum politics as distant from daily life? Here's the practical lesson. Cultural battles are rarely just about culture. They are about who gets to define reality, about whose faces and stories appear in textbooks, in paintings, in public memory. The fight over the National Portrait Gallery is also a fight over the kind of country America wants to be. When political forces seek to rewrite the story, they are, in effect, trying to shape the future. If you care about the stories your children will learn, the art that inspires your community, or simply the right to disagree and debate openly, then you are already a stakeholder in this battle. The consequences reach far beyond Washington. So, what can you do concretely? First, stay informed. Moments like these rarely make headlines for long, but their impact is lasting. Pay attention to who is steering your local museum, library, or university. Get to know their mission statements, their funding sources, and yes, their vulnerabilities. When controversies erupt, be it over a fired director or a censored exhibit, lend your voice. Send emails, attend trustees' meetings, or simply share accurate information with your friends and family. Second, support independent art and journalism. As federal funding becomes a political football, private citizens and communities become more important than ever. Even a small donation to cultural institutions or local artists can help safeguard creative independence. If you visit museums, buy a membership. If you love history, support historical societies or independent documentarians. Third, remember that history is not written in stone. It is debated, revised, and sometimes rescued from oblivion. By questioning received narratives and looking closely at who is telling the story, you can protect the diversity and complexity that real history demands. Even a simple conversation with your children or friends about why certain portraits hang in the gallery and others do not can be an act of resistance. Finally, recognize the lessons from moments like this. Free societies protect their storytellers, even those who make us uncomfortable. When art and history become tools of propaganda, when dissenting voices are silenced, the worst chapters of the past threaten to repeat themselves. As Shannon Jackson, chair of UC Berkeley's History of Art Department, powerfully observed, democratic countries don't censor culture to market a national administration autocratic countries do. Many viewers wonder, is this really a new phenomenon, or simply the latest chapter in a long struggle? Here's a secret fact you might not know. The Smithsonian's very first secretary, Joseph Henry, fought off political attempts to control exhibits all the way back in the 1850s, refusing to use the museum to promote any party's ideology. The battle for cultural independence is as old as the institution itself. What's new is the scale and visibility, amplified by social media and divided politics. So, will Kim Sajet's dismissal stand? Legally, the odds are against it. But even a symbolic victory could embolden further attempts at political interference, not just in the Smithsonian, but across the entire tapestry of American culture. The ultimate outcome may depend less on court rulings and more on public resolve. In the coming weeks, keep your eyes on the headlines. Will Congress act decisively? Will museums adapt or retreat? Will private citizens step up where public funds fade? The answers will shape not just the fate of one director or even one museum, but the way America remembers itself. As the story unfolds, remember that you too play a role in this living portrait. If you found this exploration eye-opening, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell for more deep dives into the battles shaping our culture. And if you have a story about art, history, or politics clashing in